During the year 1917, the United States experienced one of the most turbulent, bloodiest, and most chaotic moments that the nation's history had ever witnessed. The World War, which had begun years earlier as a conflict of military reform and territorial expansion, had slowly transformed into an armed conflict that seemed to have no visible end, that monthly cost thousands of lives and left deep scars not only in the territory, but in the soul of the nation. President Woodrow Wilson, whose name struck fear into the Central Powers and whose reputation as a strategic leader had spread throughout all of Europe, had launched a devastating, monumental, almost apocalyptic offensive against the German troops that were trying to maintain control over the Western Front. His armies moved like waves of fire and steel, traversed the forests and mountains of Virginia and Pennsylvania, sowing chaos wherever they went, destroying entire villages, interrupting communication lines and completely isolating the German positions that found themselves in remote positions. In this context of boundless violence, in this atmosphere of death that seemed to envelop every part of the eastern United States, General James Williams's brigade found itself in such a desperate situation that the high-ranking officers in Washington had begun to consider them as practically lost. His men, 800 American soldiers, including regular infantry, some cavalry elements, and a small contingent of field artillery, were trapped, completely surrounded, in the rugged and merciless mountains of Pennsylvania. These were not mountains like those that existed in other regions of the United States. They were cruel, inhospitable mountains, where the ravines sank hundreds of meters deep, where the terrain was so steep that the men needed 3 hours to climb heights that could be covered in 30 minutes in flat territory. These peaks and valleys were completely surrounded by German forces that had methodically and deliberately cut off every possible escape route. The Americans found themselves in a position that could only be described as a death trap, a cage of stone from which there seemed to be no way out. The most terrifying thing for the men trapped in these mountains was that they were completely isolated from the known world. There was no possibility of contacting the military base in Washington, which was almost 95 kilometers away in a straight line, a distance that led through impossible terrain, without being able to contact the base, without the possibility of receiving reinforcements that would never come, without fresh supplies that could feed the men who grew weaker each day, without medications for the wounded who constantly multiplied, without this connection to the outside world that is fundamental for the morale of any military unit. Colonel John Smith, the commanding officer of this brigade, was an experienced professional soldier with more than 20 years of service in the American Army, a man who had participated in campaigns before the World War, who had traveled throughout the country, who had seen and survived situations that would have killed men less trained and disciplined. But despite all his experience, despite the years he had spent commanding troops, despite the campaigns he had successfully completed on other occasions, Colonel Smith found himself in October 1917 watching his soldiers grow visibly weaker hourly, daily. It was like watching men disappear before one's own eyes, as if life was slowly leaving them, as if each sunrise brought something less hope, something less reason to fight. The wounded constantly increased. Men who had received gunshot wounds. Men who had suffered bone fractures in nightly skirmishes with German scouts. Men who were consumed by infections that could not be treated because no medicines were available. The troops' morale reached rock bottom, sinking deeper each day, each night that passed without news from outside, each sunrise that brought the realization that the Germans were still there, patiently waiting for the Americans to become weak enough for the final attack. Some of the younger soldiers, the recruits without experience in military campaigns, began to murmur during the cold nights in camp. They said things like everything was lost, that death was only a matter of time, that perhaps it would be best to accept the inevitable, simply surrender and avoid further suffering. Colonel Smith sometimes heard them during his nightly rounds through the camp and his heart broke, because he knew the men were right, that their situation from a tactical and strategic standpoint was practically hopeless. The Germans were tightening the noose ever closer, narrowing the net around the Americans' necks, knowing that it was only a matter of patience before hunger, lack of ammunition, and lack of medications would do the dirty work for them, weakening the Americans until they couldn't even stand up from the ground, until they simply fell where they stood from pure exhaustion. Smith had witnessed too many battles in his long career as a professional soldier, had lost too many comrades on dusty battlefields where the air filled with dust and the smell of blood, had seen men die in ways he deeply wanted to forget, but which visited him every night in his most terrible nightmares. Men who slowly bled to death from wounds they could not cauterize, men who were burned by artillery explosions that left them barely recognizable, men who screamed the names of wives and children while taking their last breath in the arms of comrades who could do nothing to help them. But never in his entire life as a soldier had he felt as powerless as in this October 1917, when he contemplated 800 men under his command and knew deep in his soul that without some form of communication with Washington, without a miracle that would allow the military base to know where they were all practically condemned to die in these inhospitable mountains. condemned to disappear without anyone really knowing what had happened. There were no radios at that time, no modern communication technology. Long-range radios had not yet been developed or were not available to the American Army. There was no telephone that could traverse the mountainous terrain, no copper cable that ran through these impossible ravines. There was no technology of any kind that could save the forgotten. All that existed for long-distance communication was the old, what had worked for centuries, mounted messengers and in special cases carrier pigeons, these birds that during past wars, during vanished empires had transported messages. The mounted messengers that Smith had tried to send in the previous days had vanished like ghosts in the mountains, probably captured by German scouts, probably eliminated in ambushes deliberately set up in the steep and treacherous mountain paths. It was like being on an island, surrounded by enemies, completely invisible to the outside world, completely forgotten by the rest of the American Army, which was busy in other battles in other parts of the eastern United States. The silence that surrounded the camp was deafening, suffocating, like a physical weight that pressed against each man's chest. It was a slow death sentence, executed not by bullets or swords, but by despair, by loneliness, by the complete feeling of abandonment that comes from realizing that no one in the world knows where you are or if you are alive. It was in a moment of complete desperation, when everything seemed hopelessly lost and death lurked at every corner, in every shadow of the mountain, that Colonel John Smith remembered an option he had almost completely forgotten, because he held it to be obsolete, antiquated, buried in the past. He remembered the military pigeon loft of New York, an institution that seemed more suited to a medieval age than to the 20th century, an institution that somehow was still functioning at full capacity during the World War, in the chaos and tumult of those years. According to the military records that Smith had reviewed years earlier, when he was a young lieutenant in Washington, when everything was different and the World War seemed impossible, there were carrier pigeons in New York, birds that were specifically trained for urgent communication missions. Pigeons that theoretically could fly great distances and carry crucial encrypted messages in specially designed metal capsules. It was an old deployment, almost from a completely different era, inherited from communication tactics that the ancient Greeks and Romans had used thousands of years ago, techniques that had been rediscovered and improved during the Middle Ages, that had been used with great success in the Napoleonic Wars of Europe. In this moment of absolute desperation, when it seemed there were no other options, it was the last card Smith could play before all the men under his command would be exterminated, massacred, forgotten. Smith took paper and pen with hands that visibly trembled from cold, adrenaline, and the nerves that had accumulated over weeks of siege, and began to write the message that could mean the difference between glorious victory and total massacre of 800 human souls. Each word had to count, each letter had to be precise, because literally the lives of men rested on this black ink that was spilled onto the paper. In the records of the military pigeon loft of New York, records that were jealously guarded by the trainers and caretakers, there was a special notation, a highlighted comment about a carrier pigeon that was different from all the others. Her name was the Silver, an affectionate nickname that the pigeon loft caretakers had given her, because her plumage had an unusual gray-silver tint, almost iridescent, that gleamed differently depending on the exact way the sunlight hit her. She was not just a beautiful pigeon to look at, although she certainly was that, with this almost ethereal quality that distinguished her from her companions. The Silver was an extraordinary, almost legendary pigeon in American military circles of the time, a living being that had developed abilities that the trainers could not fully explain with the science available at that time, at a time when biology was still a relatively young science. She was of pure Spanish breed, direct descendant of war pigeon lines that had been imported years earlier from the Iberian Peninsula, specifically brought by the federal government, when that regime was still in power, when President Wilson still governed the United States with a firm hand. Her genealogy was meticulously, carefully documented, in records that the caretakers guarded practically like sacred relics, because they intuitively knew they were caring for one of the best carrier pigeons that had ever existed on American territory, perhaps even in all of North America. The Silver was not simply a trained bird, a biological machine for transporting information. She was a living phenomenon. An almost perfect combination of superior genetics inherited from centuries of careful selection, experience accumulated through hundreds of successful flights, and something else indefinable. Something that the caretakers could not explain scientifically but intuitively felt when they were near the bird. The most extraordinary thing about the Silver was not just her physical appearance, although her amber eyes shone with an almost human intelligence that deeply impressed anyone who looked directly at them for more than a moment. These eyes seemed to contain an ancient wisdom, as if the bird had lived several lives in previous incarnations and remembered crucial lessons from all of them. These eyes seemed to know things that other eyes would never know, seemed to see beyond the present moment, beyond the visible. It was her orientation instinct, this almost magical, almost supernatural ability. She seemed to have to find her way back, Even under the most adverse circumstances, under the most impossible weather conditions, in terrain she had never seen before in her life, the military trainers who cared for her in New York said, whispering, when they believed no one was listening, in moments of confidence after they had drunk some whiskey, that the silver possessed something special. Something that went beyond the ordinary. They said the bird had a direct connection to the Earth's magnetic forces, that she could detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field with a sensitivity that other living beings did not possess, that perhaps she had a perception of the cosmos that completely transcended what science could explain at that historical point. Some of the more superstitious caretakers, men who had grown up in rural traditions, who believed in the supernatural, who deeply respected the invisible forces of the universe, whispered quietly that the silver had a divine gift, that God Himself had blessed, anointed her with abilities that completely exceeded the normal biological limits of any bird. When the silver prepared for an important flight, when she knew she was being transported to a place from which she would have to fly back, her movements were conscious, precise, calculated, almost meditated, as if she mentally consulted an inner compass that nothing and no one in the entire world could disturb. Her wings moved with perfect symmetry, each movement coordinated with a precision that seemed impossible. Her eyes focused on a distant point that only she could see, some place on the horizon that her mind mysteriously understood, and then she simply launched toward her destination with absolute certainty that modern airplane pilots, those brave men who flew in primitive machines of fabric and wood, would envy even with all their available technology. Colonel John Smith knew the reputation of the silver from previous military communications, from encrypted messages that circulated among the high commanders of the American Army during the years before the World War, when the country still enjoyed relative peace. These messages spoke of the best resources available in crisis situations, listed elite units, superior weapons, the most competent officers, and always, in the documents regarding emergency communication, the name of the silver appeared. Smith knew, because he had seen it written in official documents, that she was the best available specimen in American pigeon lofts, perhaps even in all of North America, a pigeon whose success rate in message deliveries had reached almost incredible percentages that would make any statistician doubt their accuracy. It was rumored, in the military canteens where officers met to drink whiskey and share war stories, that the silver had completed no fewer than over 300 successful flights without a single registered failure, without a single message that had not precisely reached its destination. But what Smith did not know, what would keep him awake in the nights before his final decision, what would rob him of sleep if he had known it at this precise moment, was that the silver had never flown the specific route he needed her to fly. She had never attempted to traverse this exact distance, over this exact terrain, through these specific and dangerous ravines. 95 kilometers. That was what separated Smith's camp in the Pennsylvania mountains from the military base in Washington. 95 kilometers that seemed to have been designed by the hand of a cruel God who wanted to test the absolute limits of the possible. The path led through deep ravines with almost vertical rock walls. Places where gravity seemed to behave in strange and confusing ways, where getting lost meant falling into the darkness of those bottomless deep cracks, falling for seconds until hitting the sharp rocks that waited below. It led through unknown valleys, territories that did not appear on available maps, territories full of aerial predators like golden eagles and peregrine falcons, birds of prey that saw a carrier pigeon as an easy lunch, as an opportunity to hunt her in the open sky and devour her small but nutritious body. It crossed highlands where the air behaved completely unpredictably, where vertical currents could hurl a bird with equal ease into empty space or onto the rocky ground, without discrimination. It was a route that never would a responsible military trainer have recommended, not even for a bird like the silver, regardless of her almost legendary reputation, regardless of her proven abilities during 3 decades of training. It was, to be completely honest and without any exaggeration, practically impossible. The most experienced officers in the Washington base, the military men who had years of experience studying the capabilities of carrier pigeons, had carefully analyzed the path on detailed maps, traced the route with millimeter precision and had reached the inevitable conclusion that only a statistical probability of 1 in 10 existed that the bird would even survive the initial launch, barely a chance of 1 in 10 that she would successfully take off and gain enough altitude to avoid the initial obstacles. And that was if everything went perfectly. If there were no storms. If no predators were waiting. If everything conspired in favor of the bird instead of conspiring against her. Nevertheless, Colonel Smith, this experienced man who had seen too many deaths, who had made too many impossible decisions on the battlefield, who deeply understood the weight of military responsibility, did what only a completely desperate soldier can do when he feels the abyss opening beneath his feet and no other option is available. When he has exhausted all his alternatives, he made the riskiest, boldest decision of his entire military career, a decision that could have meant his court-martial if it failed completely, even his execution if things went terribly wrong. He categorically ordered that the silver be sent from New York to his location, that she be transported under maximum military protection, that she be brought through dangerous territory to the Pennsylvania mountains where he and his 800 men were trapped under constant enemy fire. The night when the silver finally arrived in the Pennsylvania mountains, after a journey that had lasted 4 full days in a military wagon through dangerous territory, the sky over the United States seemed to have gone completely mad. As if the gods themselves were waging a titanic war against the earth and against everything that lived on it. It was not simply an ordinary storm, not even a strong storm. It was a meteorological phenomenon of apocalyptic proportions, something so extraordinary in its magnitude, so overwhelming in its power, that the farmers and local inhabitants of those remote regions of Pennsylvania would talk about this specific night for decades, transmitting it from generation to generation as one of those stories that define the collective memory of a people, that become legend. The winds blew with absolutely monstrous force, practically at the level of an extreme hurricane, uprooting giant trees by the roots as if they were simple useless weeds, toppling wooden structures that had stood for years, even decades, and creating a deafening sound that seemed to emanate literally from hell itself, from the abyss of darkness. It was a sound that was not simply noise. It was as if nature itself was screaming. As if the planet was experiencing pain. The rain did not fall conventionally. Not the way the men were accustomed to seeing. It bombarded, attacked, struck, as if it were an invisible and conscious enemy force, consciously directed against every living being that dared to be exposed to it. The water drops came with such violence that they seemed like small stones, capable of leaving deep bruises on the skin of men who dared to go outside without extreme protection. The sky lit up constantly, almost continuously, without pause, with lightning so bright that they literally split the atmosphere in two like a knife and left scars of pure fire in the dark clouds. These bolts of pure electricity were invariably, without fail, followed by thunder so powerful, so deep, so reverberating, that they did not seem to come from the distant sky, but from the bowels of the earth itself, as if it were the planet itself that was protesting against something. Smith's men instinctively covered their ears, frightened, full of fear that their eardrums would simply explode under the raw acoustic pressure of those superhuman thunders. Some of the younger soldiers cried from fear, from the sensory overload their bodies were experiencing. It was as if nature itself had become the enemy, as if all the forces of the universe had aligned to destroy any hope that might exist in this miserable camp. In this context of absolute and uncontrollable chaos, where nature seemed unleashed in its most primitive and irrational fury, where the meteorological conditions were so adverse, so hostile, that they would have discouraged even the most experienced and brave pilots of the time, pilots who were already flying in primitive airplanes in other parts of the world, in France and other places where European war raged. Colonel John Smith made a decision that bordered on what could legitimately be considered insane, desperate, almost suicidal. He did not ask his subordinate officers for advice. He did not convene a war council for consultation. He did not consult with his experienced sergeants. He simply approached, alone, with determined step, the place where they had sheltered the silver, the small improvised refuge where the Pigeon was resting, still recovering from the arduous multi-day journey that had brought her from New York to these mountains that seemed cursed by the gods. With a determination that only arises when complete desperation overshadows any consideration of prudence, Smith retrieved the silver from the refuge where she had been safely kept from the worst of the elements, where she had been protected from wind and rain. He took her gently, carefully, in his calloused hands, hands of a professional soldier that had fired rifles, that had held sabers, that had written battle reports for over 20 years, hands that knew how to kill and how to protect. With surprising care for a man in his state of extreme stress, Smith meticulously fastened the small brass capsule containing the encrypted message to the bird's right leg and verified that the attachment was perfect, that nothing could come loose during the most dangerous flight any pigeon had ever undertaken. The message contained in this metal capsule was nothing less than distilled hope on paper and ink, concentrated, compressed. These were encrypted words that represented information that could save 800 human lives or irreversibly condemn them to death. There were the exact coordinates of their position in the mountains. Numbers that had to be millimeter precise, almost accurate to the arcsecond, so that the artillery from Washington would reach the right places and bombard the German enemy positions instead of their own American positions, which would have been a catastrophe. There were the detailed combat numbers. How many soldiers remained under his command? How much ammunition they had in storage? How many food rations they had for how many more days? There were the health conditions of the troop after weeks of fighting without rest, without medicines, almost without adequate food. There were also the desperate, almost pleading requests for reinforcements, for fresh food that was not dried salt pork, for medicines for the wounded who increased daily in number, for artillery ammunition to support the defense. All of this, every number, every carefully chosen word, was encrypted in a code that Colonel Smith had memorized years earlier at the military academy. Almost a decade ago, a code that he fervently trusted that the receiving officer at the Washington base would also know and be able to correctly decipher in urgency. It was a code from before the war, from times when communication was slower but also safer, more reliable. Smith had spent hours composing this message in the relative quiet of his tent, carefully choosing each word, knowing that each term had implications, making sure it contained all vital information without being too long, so the Pigeon wouldn't carry excessive weight that would slow her down or exhaust her faster. With the storm raging furiously around him, while the wind literally threatened to throw him from the cliff where he stood, while lightning illuminated his face tanned by sun and age, hard like leather, his determined eyes reflecting the light of electricity, Colonel John Smith carefully lifted the silver in his trembling hands. The bird was surprisingly light, delicate, almost fragile compared to Smith's muscular body. Her bones were practically hollow, like those of all her kind, adapted over millions of years of evolution to fly with maximum efficiency, to be able to ascend without staying where the air is too dense. Her small legs trembled visibly, either from the penetrating cold or from animal fear or probably from both reasons combined. Her amber eyes looked at Smith with an expression that seemed to contain a complex mixture of primal fear, of animal uncertainty in the face of nature's uncontrolled fury, but also something else indefinable, something deeper. A kind of determination that seemed to go beyond simple survival instincts. In this moment frozen in time, in this hellish night where nature seemed consciously to be on the enemy's side, where every known physical element actively conspired against every living being that dared to be exposed to its unleashed fury, Colonel Smith carefully spread the silver's wings to the stormy sky, to this chaotic atmosphere full of dangers. The bird's gray and silver feathers gleamed for a moment in the light of a particularly bright lightning bolt, as if they were silvered with pure cosmic electricity. All hope of 800 men, all possibility of survival for this military brigade abandoned in the mountains, all difference between the glory of victory and total massacre of defenseless soldiers now rested on this small carrier pigeon that was about to plunge into the most violent, most hostile, most dangerous void she had ever encountered in her entire life. Smith felt the bird tense in his calloused hands, as the silver intuitively perceived the colossal magnitude of what she was about to do, what was expected of her. For a moment, a fraction of a second that seemed to last like an entire eternity, Colonel and Pigeon looked directly into each other's eyes. In this silent contact, in this communication that went beyond verbal language, something invisible but real seemed to be transmitted. It was as if the Colonel transferred all his accumulated military experience, all his personal faith in human survival, all his will to live and protect his men into the silver's small amber eyes, and the bird seemed, in a way that modern science cannot yet fully explain, in a way that transcends our rational understanding, to understand. She seemed to comprehend that she was, in this night of apocalyptic horror, the only remaining bridge between life and death, the only connection between the isolated camp and the outside world, the only hope of 800 men who were on the verge of being massacred if the message did not arrive. With a final gesture, almost like a formal military salute, Colonel Smith raised his arms to the storm sky and released the silver. The bird spread her wings completely and beat with a force that seemed impossible for such a small, such fragile body. For one agonizing moment that seemed to last forever, the silver was almost swept backward by the furious wind, her wings fighting desperately against the raw force of unleashed nature. But then, with an incredibly agile turn of her small but powerful body, with a flexibility that seemed impossible, the silver oriented herself toward Washington. Her inner orientation instinct, this supernatural gift that characterized her and distinguished her from all other pigeons in the world, seemed to activate automatically, as if an invisible switch had been turned on in her brain. The silver's wings were imperceptibly directed westward, to the place where her home pigeon loft in New York was, to the place where she carried the message that could save 800 human lives from certain death. The small pigeon disappeared into the storm, swallowed by the torrential rain and absolute darkness, becoming visible only for a moment as a barely recognizable shadow before completely disappearing from Colonel Smith's sight and vanishing into the black clouds. The Colonel remained there, standing on the cliff lashed by the cataclysmic wind, staring fixedly at the place where the silver had disappeared into chaos, wondering if he would ever learn again what had happened to this extraordinary little pigeon. He wondered if the decision he had just made would make him go down in history as a brilliant hero or as a desperate madman who had committed a fatal error. What happened in the next 38 hours was something that fundamentally challenged the limits of the biologically possible, something that the biologists and ornithology experts of the time simply could not explain with their available scientific knowledge, their theoretical systems. The silver plunged from the cliff where Colonel Smith stood, with a determination that seemed almost conscious, almost human, spread her wings against a wind that literally threatened to tear her apart in the air, to fragment her small body into 1,000 pieces that would fall helplessly into the deep abysses of the Pennsylvania mountains. The natural elements seemed to have consciously, actively, almost deliberately conspired against her, as if all of nature's fury had concentrated on this single malicious purpose: to prevent this pigeon from reaching her destination, to stop her on her journey, to make her fail in her mission. From the first moment of her flight, from the exact instant her wings began to beat against the hostile air, the silver faced challenges that would have been completely fatal for the vast majority of birds, even those with significant experience in long-distance flights. The turbulent winds that blew through the deep ravines of Pennsylvania, these ravines that seemed designed to create the worst possible flight conditions, lifted her abruptly, violently to ever greater heights, where the air was too thin, too poor in oxygen for her small bird lungs to function properly. Sometimes, the silver found herself more than 14,500 feet above sea level, in territory where even people trained in mountain climbing would have serious breathing difficulties, where oxygen deficiency would cause dizziness and mental confusion. Her wings beat frantically, worked harder than ever before in her entire life as a bird, pumping air through her specialized air sacs and trying desperately to maintain the altitude she needed to avoid crashing against the threateningly towering rock walls of the ravine that loomed menacingly on both sides. The torrential rains that bombed mercilessly from the sky, dark as the wolf's mouth, constantly soaked her feathers, minute by minute, hour by hour, destroying the perfect aerodynamic structure that millions of years of biological evolution had meticulously perfected. The water adhered to her beautiful plumage, making her literally heavier with each passing minute, each additional drop like a small death sentence, gradually adding weight, robbing the lift force she desperately needed to stay in the air and not fall. There were moments when the silver literally lost altitude uncontrollably, sinking dangerously toward the dark and deep ravines, seeing the approaching sharp rocks, possibly seeing her own death approaching, feeling the primary panic of all living beings when death approaches unstoppably. But then, just when everything seemed completely lost, when the end seemed to have come, her wings found again the air current that miraculously saved her, lifted her again to the sky, gave her this additional chance to continue her mission, to keep flying. The lightning struck so close to the silver that she could literally feel the burning heat of pure electricity that passed through the air immediately surrounding her. On at least 3 different occasions, the silver was, according to what could later be determined based on the slight burn marks that would later appear on some of her feathers, only meters, perhaps only a few meters away from being directly struck by a bolt of cosmic energy. Each direct hit would have meant her immediate death. Her body would have fallen like a stone from the sky, disappeared in the darkness of the stormy night, never found in these deep and remote ravines. The thunder that followed each lightning bolt was so powerful, so deafeningly mighty, that it literally completely disoriented the bird and affected the microscopic inner organs in her head, in her tiny but complex brain, that she used to navigate by the Earth's magnetic field, this navigation system that most living beings have but which is almost completely unknown to us humans. It's like a living compass in their body, imprinted in their DNA after millions of years of evolution. Despite all these monstrous obstacles, all this natural fury that seemed specifically, consciously designed to destroy the silver, to end her life, to make her fail in her mission, the bird continued flying. Her orientation instinct, this almost supernatural gift that characterized her, this genetic trait that distinguished her from all other living pigeons, kept her constantly directed toward Washington, although she had never in her entire life flown this exact route before. It was as if she possessed an invisible map imprinted deep in her mind, an inner compass that could not be confused or distracted by external elements. Perhaps it was the Spanish breed in her, this genetic inheritance from war pigeons that had flown for centuries in European military campaigns, had crossed oceans, had survived conditions that would have destroyed less extraordinary birds. Perhaps it was simply the extraordinary will to survive combined with a purpose that the bird somehow, in a way that science cannot fully explain, seemed to understand, that her arrival in Washington meant the difference between life and death for many men who depended on her. While the silver traversed the deepest ravines of Pennsylvania in this hellish night, she also faced additional dangers that went beyond the meteorological elements. Nocturnal aerial predators hunted in the storm, giant great horned owls and golden eagles, who normally would not hunt under such brutal conditions, but whom primal hunger and predatory instinct had driven from their nests. The silver had to evade attacks on at least 5 different occasions during her flight and literally felt the sharp talons of a great horned owl that grazed her feathers, missing by only centimeters. Her extraordinary speed, her supernatural agility, her ability to change direction instantly, in a way that was almost impossible for such a small bird, was what saved her in these deadly encounters. An ordinary pigeon would have been caught, devoured, would have failed in her mission. But the silver was extraordinary, exceptional, almost supernatural in her flight abilities. The night stretched eternally for the silver and seemed to last longer than it should have lasted. There were no normal cycles of rest and activity. The bird simply continued flying, beating her wings with determination, pushing through the devastating storm, traversing dangerous ravines, climbing over highlands where the air was thinner but also more predictable, more manageable. Her muscles burned with absolute pain. Her lungs burned as if they were on fire. Her heart beat in a rhythm that very few living beings could maintain for so long without the organ collapsing. But something in the silver, something deep, something that was greater than physical pain, something that was almost spiritual, kept her moving forward, forced her to continue. The message in the brass capsule bound to her leg felt psychologically as if it weighed tons, as if it were the heaviest thing she had ever carried. But she carried it, actively protected it, cared for it, somehow understanding that this small metal container was of colossal importance, that everything depended on it. When finally, after 38 hours of practically uninterrupted flight, the first lights of dawn slowly began to illuminate the eastern horizon, when the storm finally began to diminish its apocalyptic fury, when the winds began to calm slightly, the silver saw the first recognizable signs of human civilization. She saw the red brick roofs of Washington emerging from the barren and desolate landscape, saw the military structures that she had known since her childhood in the Pigeon loft, saw the specific Pigeon loft that was her destination, her final objective, her home. Her wings, which had flown for over 30 hours without true rest, without being able to pause even for a moment to recover, found the last energy reserves that remained in her small but extraordinary body. With the final meters of her epic journey, the silver flew low over the walls of the military city and dodged surprised soldiers who could not believe what they saw. It was not possible, they thought, that a bird had flown in this storm. It was not possible that something so small had survived. The soldiers in Washington first thought it was a miracle, a supernatural manifestation. A carrier pigeon, completely destroyed by the journey, soaked from head to toe, her feathers glued to her skeletal body, her wings visibly trembling from extreme exhaustion that no living being should endure, fell practically from the sky like a small fulfilled prophecy. Like a blessing from heaven. She carried a brass capsule on her right leg, and in this capsule was the message that would change everything that was to happen. 38 hours exactly after she had taken off from the Pennsylvania mountains, destroyed by the elements, completely soaked, her beautiful plumage glued to her skeletal and consumed body, her wings trembling from extreme exhaustion that seemed impossible for any biological creature to endure. The silver arrived in Washington like an apparition, like a fulfilled spirit, but the journey she had completed was not simply an act of extraordinary physical endurance. It was an act that challenged all known laws of avian biology, that contradicted all mathematical calculations of the military trainers, that mocked all predictions that the most recognized scientists of the time would have made if someone had presented them with the numbers. The guards at the Washington military fort were the first to see her flying through the morning sky, although they could barely believe what their eyes saw in that moment. A small, almost ghostly shadow moved irregularly against the sky that still showed visible remains of the storm that had lashed the region during the entire previous night. When the silver descended, she did so dramatically that several soldiers quickly ran to intercept her, in terrible fear that the bird would crash on the hard ground and strike fatally. But instead, with a final act of determination that seemed to be pure conscious act of will, almost rational decision, the silver spread her destroyed wings and landed in the fort's courtyard with a precision that was almost supernatural. As if she had flown directly to the exact mental coordinates of the place where she needed to be, as if her inner instinct guided her even after 38 hours of exhausting flight. The bird was in a state that would have made anyone with a sensitive heart cry, anyone who could appreciate suffering. Her gray-silver plumage, which was normally beautiful and shining like polished silver, was now completely dull, extinguished, glued to the body as if it were a second skin of wet and cold tar. Her amber eyes, which ordinarily shone with penetrating intelligence, were now glassy, barely focused, as if they were looking from the edge of consciousness, as if the bird was about to lose consciousness at any moment. One of her wings showed clear evidence of having been violently struck at some point during the flight, probably by lightning or perhaps by a considerably large hailstone during the fiercest storm. Her legs trembled so much that the soldiers feared she would simply collapse under the weight of her own body, that the legs would give way under the bird's mass. However, despite all this obvious damage, despite the evident proximity of death that surrounded every fiber of her tiny being, despite everything she had suffered, the silver had kept the brass capsule firmly secured to her leg. That was the truly miraculous thing, what seemed impossible. None of the natural elements, none of the raw forces that the storm had unleashed during 38 hours had been able to separate this small metal cylinder from its place. It was as if the pigeon had made a pact with herself, an unbreakable promise that this message would reach its destination, even if it were the last thing she did in this life. even if she had to die immediately afterward. Lieutenant James Johnson, who was responsible for receiving military communications in Washington, quickly came to the courtyard when the guards called him with urgent shouts. What he saw impressed him so deeply that he was literally speechless for several complete seconds, unable to process what his eyes saw. It was an experience so outside the ordinary, so unexpected, so completely unlikely, that his brain needed a moment to process what was happening. Johnson had been a soldier for 18 years, had seen things that most civilians would never experience, had lived in war, had seen death, had commanded soldiers, but he had never seen anything that approached this. A pigeon that literally looked as if she had traversed hell itself to reach this earth courtyard. As if she had flown through the apocalypse. With cautious, conscious movements, trying not to cause further damage to a bird who was already in such fragile, such precarious conditions that she seemed she could collapse at any moment, Lieutenant Johnson slowly approached the silver and began carefully working on freeing the capsule. His hands, trained through years of military experience in handling delicate communications, worked with a tenderness that seemed barely possible to come from a professional war soldier. He knew intuitively that this message, whatever its exact content, had traveled through hell itself to reach this precise moment, and he could not afford to make the mistake of damaging it just because he was rough or thoughtless. When he finally managed to free the capsule and extract the small brass cylinder from the silver's leg, after several minutes of delicate work, Lieutenant Johnson noticed something that deepened even more the mystery and absolute magnitude of what was happening. The pigeon practically collapsed on the ground at the exact moment when the capsule was removed from her leg, as if she had maintained consciousness only through responsibility, only through the duty to ensure that this message reached its destination intact. It was as if the silver had understood on an almost supernatural level that her mission was to stay alive, upright until the last moment, to guarantee successful delivery. It seemed as if the pigeon had entered a state of pain denial, suspension of natural fatigue processes, only to fulfill her mission. The lieutenant opened the brass capsule with fingers that trembled from expectation and some emotion he could not fully identify, a mixture of hope and the importance of the historical moment. Inside was the message from Colonel Smith, written in military cipher that Johnson immediately recognized from his years of academic training. The handwriting was claustrophobic, cramped, excited, as if Smith had written under extreme pressure, as if each word he wrote brought him closer to the damnation or salvation of his men. The ink was, miraculously, despite all the rain and humidity of the epic journey through the storm, readable. With hands that now trembled for other reasons that had to do with the magnitude of what he was reading, Lieutenant Johnson began to decipher the encrypted message. Each decoded word revealed more clearly the desperate situation of the 800 American soldiers trapped in the Pennsylvania mountains, completely surrounded by German forces, without supplies, without ammunition, without hope except for this small carrier pigeon that had just accomplished the impossible. The exact coordinates were there, precise to the second of arc. The detailed numbers of remaining troops, available ammunition, food supplies, the urgent requests for reinforcements, for artillery support, for medical supplies. Everything Smith needed to save his men was contained in this message that had traveled through the apocalypse itself. Within hours, the entire military apparatus of Washington was mobilized. Artillery units were positioned according to the exact coordinates provided by Smith. Supply convoys were organized to reach the mountains. Reinforcement troops were prepared for immediate deployment. The message that the silver had carried through hell had set in motion a rescue operation that would save 800 American lives. Colonel Smith and his men were rescued 3 days later. When American artillery bombardment had eliminated the German positions and relief columns had reached the mountains. Of the 800 soldiers, 743 survived, a survival rate that military historians would later call miraculous given the circumstances. The silver, after delivering her message, was cared for by the best military veterinarians in Washington. She recovered slowly but completely from her epic journey. She lived for many more years in the New York Pigeon loft, where she was treated as a living legend, a hero whose courage had saved hundreds of lives. When she finally died, many years later, the silver was buried with military honors in a special ceremony attended by many of the soldiers whose lives she had saved. A small monument was erected in her memory, with an inscription that read, "To the silver, whose wings carried hope through the storm, and whose courage saved 800 souls." The story of the silver's flight became legend in American military circles, told and retold in military academies. A testament to the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, and to the incredible things that become possible when courage meets desperate necessity. If you're enjoying this incredible story of courage and determination, please like and subscribe to hear more amazing tales from history. This is the kind of story that reminds us that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest among us accomplish the greatest feats. Years later, military historians would study the Silver's flight as one of the most extraordinary examples of animal heroism in wartime. The flight was analyzed by scientists, who still could not fully explain how a small pigeon had survived conditions that should have been impossible to endure. Some theorized about extraordinary navigational abilities, others about superhuman endurance driven by an almost mystical sense of purpose. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Silver's story was not about the bird herself, but about the man who made the decision to send her. Colonel Smith had faced an impossible choice: accept the certain death of his men, or risk everything on what seemed like a hopeless gamble. His decision to trust in the Silver, to believe in the impossible when no other option remained, had made the difference between massacre and salvation. The storm that night had been one of the worst in Pennsylvania's recorded history. Weather stations recorded wind speeds that exceeded those of most hurricanes. Lightning strikes were so frequent and intense that several buildings in nearby towns were struck and burned. The rain fell in quantities that caused flooding throughout the region. It was, by any measure, the worst possible night to attempt any kind of flight, much less by a small bird carrying a crucial message across nearly 100 kilometers of hostile territory. Yet the Silver had not only survived the flight, she had completed it with the message intact and delivered it precisely when and where it needed to be delivered. The timing had been perfect. Any later, and the rescue operation might not have been able to save Smith's men before they were overrun by German forces. The Silver Pigeon's story became a symbol of hope and determination that transcended military circles. It was told in schools, written about in newspapers, and eventually became part of American folklore. Children learned about the brave little pigeon who flew through hell to save 800 soldiers. Artists painted dramatic scenes of her flight through the storm, writers penned poems about her courage. But for those who had been there, for Colonel Smith and the soldiers who survived because of her flight, the Silver represented something more profound than mere animal heroism. She represented the mysterious ways in which salvation can arrive when all seems lost, the unexpected forms that courage can take, and the incredible things that become possible when living beings, human or animal, refuse to accept defeat. Colonel Smith himself lived for many more years after the war, eventually rising to the rank of general. But he always said that his greatest moment as a soldier was not any victory he achieved, but the moment when he released the Silver into that apocalyptic storm, trusting her with the lives of 800 men. It was, he said, the purest act of faith he had ever committed. And the fact that this faith was rewarded remained the most profound experience of his life. The Silver's legacy lived on in the continued use of carrier pigeons by the American military throughout both world wars. Her success inspired renewed confidence in these ancient messengers, and many other pigeons followed in her flight path, carrying crucial messages across dangerous territory. Some failed, some succeeded, but all were measured against the standard that the Silver had set on that terrible night in October 1917. In the end, the Silver's story became more than just a tale of one remarkable pigeon's heroic flight. It became a testament to the power of determination, the importance of hope in desperate situations, and the extraordinary things that can happen when ordinary creatures are called upon to do extraordinary things. It reminded people that heroes are not always who we expect them to be, and that sometimes the smallest among us can accomplish the greatest feats. The message the Silver carried that night was more than just military intelligence. It was a lifeline thrown across an impossible distance, a bridge built of courage and determination that connected the doomed with salvation. And the small pigeon who carried it became proof that miracles do happen, especially when they are most desperately needed. Share this incredible story with your friends and family. Stories like this remind us of the extraordinary courage that exists in the world, and the amazing things that become possible when we refuse to give up hope, even in our darkest moments.